Good morning. As Charles has already introduced me, I'm Sophie. I ran my business RL Conservation here for 9 years, and I just finished up earlier on this year. I'm headed back home to London. And I'm talking today about two projects which I worked on during this time, both sketch models by Foley. And I'm going to start with really fabulous. What is a sketch model? A sketch model is the preliminary version which is carried out to record the forms, proportions, and compositions of a projected work. This is very different to a replica, a reproduction, or maquette. I've borrowed these pictures from the London Stone Carving Limited. Sorry, I'm very nervous, I'm really shaking. Because I think it shows quite nicely how the final sculptures come about. And Harriet did start to touch on it with her third example. So the artist starts modelling in clay because it's a malleable material, and finally comes up with you can see here in the middle, the large scale models. This is actually Queen Victoria and Prince Albert for the front of the Royal Albert Hall. Which is actually quite a nice example because, of course, it faces the Albert Memorial, which Foley was very much involved in. So once you have the final clay models and the client has approved all those final details have been put into it, they are then cast into plaster so that they can then be carved into marble, because clay, while it's lovely and malleable, needs to stay wet, because otherwise it dries out, it shrinks, it cracks, you can't use it for a long period of time to transfer your designs onto the marble. You can see at the back of this last picture the fiberglass moulds which have been used to take moulds and create the casts in plaster. This is obviously the modern technique of doing it. There are silicone inserts inside those. Foley probably would have used a plaster model, a plaster mould in order to create his plaster casts, which would have acted as the final version before they moved into the final version, if that makes sense. Creating a plaster cast in Foley's time, it's an art. There's a huge amount of skill and experience required. And just to sort of help you understand how he would have done it, I've borrowed a video from the Victoria and Albert YouTube channel, which shows you on quite a small scale the work involved, and I think it will help you to appreciate what casting something full size would have been like. I was going to click forward to 59 seconds. So you're going to have to watch the first minute of introduction. I was hoping just to be able to skip. It's still quite nice. So as you can see, creating a plaster cast is quite a complex, involved process. And plaster casts really should be considered as works of art in their own right. Over the years, they've been so abused, basically, and they've really lacked the care that so many other sculptures have been given. And what ends up happening, and we find this in collections all over the world, all the big institutions, layers and layers of paints are applied over the top of them to cover them up, to make them appear cleaner, because a bit of household paint will just do the job. And also they get lost, they get broken. People forget that plaster is a very soft material. It's not very good in tension. It's quite easily broken. For this reason, there are armatures normally put inside plaster casts. An armature is a metal formwork which provides the structure. So I'm going to start the first of my case studies by looking at 3 of the sketch models which I worked on for the Royal Dublin Society. The mother and monokji were 2 of the smaller projects I did. It was conservation maintenance. I was cleaning the surface as well as I could, given the hundreds of layers of paint that were over the top. And I carried out some small areas of consolidation, re-adhesion, just making sure that everything remained stable going forwards. It was Ino and Bacchus, which was the big project, which I'm mainly going to focus on. This is the picture from after conservation, but Nicole Collins called me in 2019 and said, Sophie, a member of the public has climbed up onto Ino and Bacchus and has damaged it. Can you help? And this is what I found when I went to visit. You can see the arm, which was high above the head, has been pulled down. And Bacchus's arm is missing, and there's fingers as well. To put this into context slightly, this Ino and Bacchus and the mother, which you saw previously, is displayed in the RDS in the foyer of the main hall. These are images from Google Maps Street View, because you can see inside the RDS, by the way, which show you the locations of these sculptures. So you can see from the front door to your right-hand side, there's Ino and Bacchus, and then you've got the doors into the main hall ahead of you, and the mother's on your left. So if you think about a concert or an exhibition or any of the big events which the RDS holds, and you've got streams of people walking through this space, and the sculptures are just there. There's no barrier between the people and the sculptures, which is great. It means you can actually see them, you can enjoy them, you can view them. The plinths are only about a metre or so high, so you can actually engage with them if you're interested in seeing sculpture. It also, unfortunately, allows it to be climbed on. And I've frequently gone past and seen cups of coffee just stood right next, on the ledge right next to the sculptures. And in this instance, someone had climbed up trying to get a selfie with Ino, and in doing so had just pulled down the arm. So close-ups of the damage which I was confronted with, you can clearly see the armature, the ferrous armature running through the plaster. There's, as a result of the weight onto the arm, it bent the armature, which caused cracking along the plaster, because obviously plaster is quite rigid, all down the front, the loss of fingers. And then there was catastrophic damage, which we weren't able to repair. There were pieces which we couldn't put back. So the RDS very kindly set up a temporary studio for me on site. And I had to start thinking about how to address this problem. There was a malleable metal armature inside, which was out of shape, and there's a rigid plaster on the outside, which isn't malleable. I performed surgery, and I removed the plaster from the armature, very carefully noting exactly where everything went, how it all fitted together, to expose the armature so that it could then be bent back into shape, so that the structure could be back in the right position. I worked with Church Art Metals to do this. They did all the manipulation under my guidance, and they managed to get it right back up to where it belonged. one of the problems was, how do you know exactly where it goes? Is it here? Is it here? What's that angle? And as conservators, it's really important that we don't change the form of what we're doing. We obviously get involved and we do have an impact, and we do change things by adding materials, but we can't change the form. We have to make sure we have the correct information to be able to proceed. From the original casting process, there was a channel left from the armature. As you can see here, what we were doing is we were holding the arm back up against the armature to ensure that the curvature and the angles all fitted back together. So it was quite lucky we had this way of knowing that the arm was going back in the perfect place. And we shifted it bit by bit, just to ensure that that position was absolutely perfect, so that when the repair happened, we were going to hand it back in exactly the same state that it had started in. So slowly, the pieces of plaster that we could put back, we re-adhered. And then the areas which had been 100% lost, I had to fill with plaster. And I added new plaster in to support the existing plaster. But we got there, and I managed to fix Bacchus's arms, fingers, or the fingers of Ino as well. And she is back looking quite spectacular. Now, during the works as well, as I mentioned earlier, plaster casts. Oh, sorry, I'm going to go back. Plaster casts are often painted over to improve their appearance, to cover over dirt. And I noticed during the works, I said to Nicole, how about we see what's underneath the paint? Because with years and years of paint going on top of paint, a lot of detail is lost. And I said, why don't we remove the paint from an area, reveal some of that detail? Let's see what condition the plaster is like underneath, because as a later project, it would be interesting to remove this household emulsion paint and actually get it back to where Foley intended it to be. And so you can see this orange stripe down the front is where the layers of paint have been removed. And we've got this beautiful orangey, bronzy sort of colour underneath. We haven't carried out any scientific analysis on it, but it looks, the quality of it very much felt like it was an intentional applied artist's layer. It is the original layer on there. Again, it's a sketch model. He would have used this to show how the final was going to be when it was cast. The second project I'm going to talk to you about is, keeps on doing that, is Oliver Goldsmith. Most of you will recognise the electrotype outside TCD on College Green. The other one is a plaster cast, which is in Palace, County Longford. When I was approached by Mairead, who's the heritage officer for Longford, she said to me, there's this plaster cast. It's related to the one outside Trinity in some way. We're not really sure what the link of it is. Is it a reproduction, something which came after that? Is it a sketch model which came before it? Can you help us with this? So this project encompassed, it was sort of the very early stages, so rather than being interventive conservation work, it became more of a research project, looking at historical research, scientific analysis and the condition in order to try and work out what significance this plaster cast had and the links to the bronze. Mairead handed me a folder filled with newspaper articles of mentions of Foley, of Goldsmith, of the campaigns for subscription, of the installation of the plaster cast in Palace. And I sort of worked my way through all this information, picking out the important parts. There was a point where I had, a wall covered in Post-it notes. It felt like I was solving a crime, just trying to understand. And there were so many different references. There were so many reproductions of Goldsmith. There's one at the RDS, which is smaller. I think there's one at one of the members' clubs on Stephen Green. You see them absolutely everywhere, and they're mentioned everywhere. And so there's so much information to try and sort out in order to understand which one which stories belong to this cast in particular. I spoke with a lot of people during this time, many of whom are sitting in this room and are talking today. Whether or not they remember, I don't know. But Paula Murphy put me on to the fact that the first sitting of the Irish Doll in 1919, all of the sculptures around the rooms were Foley plaster casts. And I think she'd said she hadn't seen Goldsmith necessarily, but she knew that there were pictures. And so I looked through the pictures of this first sitting, and there's Goldsmith in the middle. And suddenly we had a plaster cast of Goldsmith in Dublin, painted white. And we said, okay, that's quite interesting. This is a point. We know that he was bronze for this subscription for raising money for the final bronze. Are these two linked or are they different? And this is where the scientific analysis came in. I commissioned two conservation scientists from the University of Northumbria who'd worked a lot with the plaster casts at the Victoria and Albert Museum. And I provided them with samples of the stratigraphy, or the layer build-up, from the plaster substrate through the paint layers. And I said, what information can we get from here? What can we understand about what's happened to this cast from the applied surfaces? And this is where I'm going to read from my notes, because it gets all scientific and technical, and I don't want to get it wrong. So I asked them to carry out microscopy under reflected light and UV light. They also looked at the samples using SEM-EDS, which is scanning electron microscopy and energy dispersive X-ray spectroscopy, which allowed elemental characterization. They also did attenuated total reflection, Fourier transformed infrared spectroscopy, ATR-FTIR, which allowed molecular analysis. As you can see, there were a huge number of layers which they were trying to analyze and understand. What they found definitively was two layers of bronzing, one which sat above the plaster substrate, and one which happened afterwards, which had a preparation layer. So they found a plaster substrate, a layer of metal leaf, and then another preparation layer and another layer of metal leaf. They appeared to come, they had different recipes. They were able to look at the elemental composition, and so they had different recipes used to do them, so they weren't applied together. They happened at different times in this cast history. And then there is a white layer, and it's very thick. It's multiple layers of white. There's no dirt in between, which indicates that these layers of white were painted over. They were trying to hide the bronze underneath. This sort of raised flags. You went, oh, there's that white copy of Goldsmith sitting in 1919, the first sitting of the Doll. Is that the point at which it was painted? So what we did is we overlaid the scientific analysis and the historical research, and we were able to quite definitively say that this cast we were able to corroborate certain events in what we'd found, and been able to create a story for this cast and where it had been. And it's important to say that the differences in each of the samples taken indicates the number of restorations that the cast has undergone and highlights the extent of damage that's been caused over the past 150 years as a result of travelling and display. Now, my analysis of the history, of the science, is my interpretation of it. It's what made sense. I'm not saying that I'm 100% correct, but it's the stories work together of this cast, which had been created by Foley, bronzed to raise subscription, shown at international exhibitions in London and Dublin, and then again after Goldsmith had been, the bronze Goldsmith had been erected, and then 5-10 years after that it's shown again. That's maybe where it would correspond with the second layer of gilding. And then I'm sorry, I'm losing my way slightly. And then this thick white paint, it's been painted over to match the rest of these casts. And then this bronze paint applied when it ends up in 1974 in Palace. What happens to it between the sitting 1919 and 1974? It ends up in a basement in Mansion House, I think. We don't quite know why. I think they just had nowhere else to put it. And we don't know who found out that it was there and who had the impetus, or who was able to rescue it, really, and put it in 1974. But it has come out. And this is important because this is currently the condition of the cast. This is where it's sitting. The shelter that it's in is the footprint of the building which was a Goldsmith's original birthplace. It is covered, so it doesn't get rained on. There is a gate to protect it from the public, but the cast is sitting directly on flagstones, and there doesn't appear to be any damp-proof membrane. So the rising damp is coming up through the plaster, and this plaster cast has got a ferrous iron armature in it for structural stability, and that iron is slowly corroding. And the corrosion products of iron are greater than the iron itself, and so as it expands, it cracks the plaster. This is why all the pictures are of the ankles and the legs. The cracks are the worst at the bottom, where the damp is the greatest. As we go up the body, the cracking sort of stops. So we needed to understand as well, as part of this, what condition is the armature in? If we are able to move this, now that we've got the significance of the cast, now we understand what relationship he is to the bronze. There's a case to move it, to protect it, to conserve it. Is that even possible? What condition is the armature in? Oh, that is gone. There we go. So we x-rayed him. We got industrial x-ray company to come down. Their expertise is x-raying oil pipelines and industrial works for cracks and deterioration of metalwork. So they were the perfect people to come and have a look, take the x-rays, and do the measurements they needed in order to give us a commentary on what structurally this cast was like. It appears that actually the ferrous armature is in great condition, and it will be fine once the cast is moved. So the cast, I believe, has now been moved from its location. It took a while into a dry environment, in a secure environment as well, where it can dry out and sort of stabilise a bit. And then, of course, the next part of the works, which sadly I won't be involved in, will hopefully be to actually restore it. And it's going to be an interventive piece where surgery is performed and the plaster will be removed from the armature, because you have to remove the excess corrosion to get the plaster back on, fitting really nicely together. So that's the other side of conservation. Listening to Harriet's speech, I realised I hadn't really come up with a conclusion to either of my projects. They just sort of end with my involvement in them. These are the challenges that, as conservators, we deal with, and as stakeholders, as custodians, you have to deal with as well, looking after your plaster casts. So thank you to everyone who's helped me along the way, and yeah, thank you.